We are back. You are chatting with John P. Today, I'm going to be talking about vintage SEIKO and what is going on with the recently announced Bonhams auction for SEIKO watches, vintage SEIKO watches, titled Making Waves, which is going to be happening between August 17th to the 25th. So really in just a couple of short weeks. But first, please do not forget the thumbs up, like, and subscribe. I really do appreciate it, guys. Today, with YouTube, they're always changing their algorithm, and every little bit helps because I really enjoy making these videos for you, and it's so much fun kind of going back in the comments below. I try to put the first maybe hour after releasing the video to respond to comments and questions and things of that nature. And of course, you can find me on Instagram, The Real John P, and Delray Watch, where we do not have in stock, by the way. The watch on my wrist today is my personal watch in my collection, Rolex Oyster Perpetual 39 in this beautiful red grape dial, as they call it. It's really more of a purple depending on how the light hits it, but I've really started to enjoy wearing this thing as a daily. So, vintage SEIKO watches. Up until recently, vintage SEIKO watches could be had on eBay for very low prices. Now, SEIKO, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with it. You know, I've done videos in the past, and sometimes it's viewed as controversial because SEIKO collectors are extremely passionate about the brand, and for good reasons, right? Generally, people don't have problems with SEIKOs unless they do, but SEIKO has decent quality control, and there are very few problems, at least when you buy a new SEIKO watch. Now, SEIKO collectors, I'll say there's a bit of a belief within the SEIKO collecting community, or a bit of a mantra rather, for getting a good value. And because we have Delray Watch, where we trade pre-owned watches, I have always sought after good values in watches and pre-owned watches. I just think, you know, if you're going to shop for anything, why not try to get a decent, if not good value? It doesn't take very long to find a good value, so why not give that a go? But when we look at SEIKO watches now, and we pair them with this upcoming auction, it really has me questioning the future of vintage SEIKO watches. Let me explain. So, Bonhams announced a SEIKO-only auction. Now, there's going to be a couple of modern watches that are or were in extremely limited production volumes, but most of the watches in the auction are vintage SEIKO watches. Now, what's interesting, and I'll read this directly from the Bonhams webpage, and I have the quote here, but they explain themselves in a few ways, and I think it's very telling of where I see vintage SEIKO going, and towards the end of this video, it's going to make way more sense. But let me just put this in here now so you can kind of think about that while I talk about other things, is directly from their website. Bonhams is a privately owned international auction house founded in 1793. It's one of the world's largest and most renowned auctioneers of fine art and antiques, motor cars, and jewelry. Bonhams has a heritage and reputation for connoisseurship and bespoke service known throughout the world. So, in simplistic terms, a prestigious auction house that has been around for centuries. Moving forward, they've announced the SEIKO auction, and I think it's interesting, right? We're in a bit of a COVID world where, hey, let's try some interesting things and see what sticks. But when you look at the estimated sale prices for some of these watches, it really makes me scratch my head. Now, let me explain. They have one watch that is very rare, and it's kind of a name your price watch, but coming from a brand like SEIKO that doesn't have necessarily the kind of provenance, and I don't say that in a negative way, it's just historically SEIKO watches have been affordable, right? It's just something that the brand has prided themselves in, with the exception of the Grand SEIKOs of modern time and vintage time, as well as the SEIKO, the King SEIKO, and a couple other offshoots or subsidiaries of the brands in different models over time. But generally speaking, affordable. I can't say that or stress that enough. When we look at this 5718 8000, this is a steel chronograph that was made for the 1964 Tokyo Summer Olympics. Now, this watch was produced in very low volumes. I believe maybe only 50 of these are known to have exist, but they're estimating that this is going to sell between 13 and 26,000 US dollars, the equivalent in Hong Kong dollars, where the actual sale is going to be taking place. Technically, right, it's an online auction as well, but that's in Hong Kong dollars. it really makes me start to scratch my head and wonder where future Seiko is going, right? This is one example, arguably the most rare of vintage Seiko, but vintage Seiko, while it has had a passionate community of collectors, generally speaking, they are at more affordable price points compared to brands like Rolex, Patek Philippe, Vacheron, some of the other vintage brands that came with these ultra high-end fine movements like the Valjoux 72, which is featured in Newman's and so many other vintage watches, vintage Le Coultres, go on and on and on and on. And so when we look at these Seiko watches, while they may work perfectly fine, I think it's extremely interesting. Let me share with you a couple more watches, but I want to talk about at the end what I think is happening here, what could happen, and whether or not the prices are going to go up. But when we look, they also have available, the normal fare of vintage Seiko. You have the vintage Seiko chronographs, you have the Pokes, you have the bullheads, and of course you have the Seiko 6105 diver, which I believe was Seiko's second foray into dive watches, and certainly has become an iconic and arguably collectible vintage Seiko watch, mostly because it's a dive watch, and dive watches are just very hot right now. And so they're going to have the standard fare, and those prices are probably 20 to 30% higher estimated than what you find on eBay. But what this tells us, and what this tells me, and kind of what I take away from this, is that when we see an auction house, and these auction houses, Christie's, Bonhams, all the others, they have this kind of air and this, this image of being prestigious and, commanding the highest prices. You see it in these big ticket auctions for these several $1,000,000 watches that, you can sometimes find floating around out there, at least I can, inside private watch dealer groups, at considerably less. And then you factor in the closing auction price of an additional 25% for the auction house to get their cut. That's added on top of the sale price. Now we're talking big numbers. And when you transpose that onto Seiko, one of the major selling points of Seiko, and I don't collect Seiko myself, I like some of the models, the 6105 I think is very cool. But when I talk with diehard Seiko collectors, one of the biggest selling points for vintage Seiko is you can get a cool vintage watch that is probably going to run pretty well, probably, and by pretty well, I mean probably not chronometer spec, let alone any watch of that age you shouldn't really consider to run chronometer spec. But the major selling point aside from that is going to be how approachable compared to counterparts from Rolex, from Omega, from Swiss brands that Seiko is. And when we see auction houses setting the precedent, putting the historical sales data out there, I think times might be changing for vintage Seiko. Now, I'm not saying that I necessarily want the prices to go up. Personally, we're not going to carry them at delraywatch.com because our service center can't really work on them, nor can really any service center, especially Seiko. The parts are basically non-existent. Seiko policy is to only carry parts a few years back. All these calibers and movements that they have, while they're using some variation of them currently, the parts are just not out there. Case parts, forget it. Serviceability, the watches were just not made to be serviced long term. Sure, I've done previous videos, people out there will say swap the movement. Okay, well that defeats the purpose of a vintage watch. You buy yourself a many decade old watch and you're going to pay a premium, and it might be in great condition, but is it going to run? You can't guarantee it. And so putting this back into the perspective of the price and what I am seeing to be one of the largest or the most popular selling points for Seiko, let alone vintage Seiko, is that affordability factor. And when we have prestigious auction houses kind of purveying these options, these vintage Seiko watches, and setting these higher price points, what is that going to mean for the future? A couple of these watches, the bullheads, the Pogues, the 6105s, you can find these all over eBay, all over Chrono24, all over the watch forums. I think there's a Japanese watch forum where you can get some great deals on these. I mean, some of these watches, a couple $100, $400, $500. The prices have been increasing, but now if we're talking about setting prices out there at auction for double, I think this sets a very dangerous precedent for when people go to sell their watch on eBay for the prices to just be very high. And so I wanted to bring up this topic as more of an awareness situation than saying whether or not I think it's good or bad, because honestly I don't really have skin in the game otherwise. I don't collect Seiko. I don't recommend anyone really start selling vintage Seiko because of the serviceability. You send the watch to anyone, it's really difficult to work on. But they are cool watches at the end of the day, and I think that they do serve a pretty interesting place and an important part of many people's collection. I can understand why people are attracted to them. But if we start seeing the prices go up on these, I wonder whether or not those Seiko collectors are going to pull back. And if you have to make a decision between a vintage Omega Seamaster or a vintage Seiko, are the vintage Seiko collectors going to start gravitating towards the watches that perhaps are offering a better value, including brand prestige? Or are we seeing a bit of a different scenario where perhaps these watches came from Seiko? We have arguably the rare Seiko watch in existence from the '64 Tokyo Summer Olympics. I could see possibly Seiko even, I'm speculating, right? I'm speculating behind a camera on the internet somewhere. I could see Seiko perhaps supplying these watches and a couple of the other standard fare classic vintage Seiko watches and saying, hey, Seiko's trying to bump up the price. I've done other videos. They've been raising their retail prices across the board, including the GS, the Grand Seiko lines as well. I could see them trying to say, hey, let's make a bit of a partnership here. Let's do this Making Waves auction, start setting some precedent out there in the marketplace, get some feedback, and start seeing if we can actually make Seiko in entirety a luxury brand and not just Grand Seiko, and get the customer willing to pay a little bit more. I don't know, guys. What do you think? Once again, I wanted to bring this up. I think it sets a very dangerous precedent to take watches that are generally everyday use, multifunction watches, and turn them and put them kind of on the stage of this prestigious auction house. Which, by the way, I'm not putting a lot of validity behind them either. I mean, I'm not going to these auctions really. I really don't care, nor have much skin in the game there either, but I think it sets dangerous precedent to take these brands, raise the price up for everyone, including the people that really love Seiko, and then where do they turn for perhaps someone that is looking for that more approachable price point vintage watch? I don't know, guys, but I want to hear your feedback. What do you think about this? Do you think that this perhaps is a bit of a play from Seiko, somehow working with the auction house, or do you think it's all just a coincidence and not a big deal? Not a conspiracy theory, just genuinely curious to hear your feedback and what you think this is going to do to the Seiko watch market as well as the vintage Seiko watch market. And remember, the auction starts August 17th, I believe, so we have until about the 25th. So we have till the 25th to go find your favorite place to find vintage Seiko and get perhaps one or two, or whichever one you were thinking of getting, get it before the hammer strikes for the final time if you want to lock in your price at current approachable price points. Guys, let me know, comments below. Please do not forget the thumbs up, like, and subscribe. I really do appreciate it. And make sure to check out delraywatch.com. Thanks, guys. You've been chatting with John P. Ciao.